Hi, thanks for joining us for another In Conversation series. So we have another wonderful special guest, Rémy Aquarone from the Pottergate Centre, who I've known for many, many years and is hugely influential in pretty much every reason why I'm here doing this series and talking about all things dissociative. So it's a fabulous moment for me to be able to interview Rémy and have this chat with him. So thank you ever so much, Rémy, for joining us and being part of our kind of funny little series of In Conversation videos. I think
you're very welcome.
I'm so it's just great. It's just a lovely moment. I think it would be really great for the people watching. They might have heard of you, but they might not know much about you. So I think this is a kind of an opportunity to just find out a little bit about yourself. So would you be able to give us a sort of like a quick history, as it were, of sort of yourself and the work that you're doing and kind of why you're here being spoken to by me today, do you think?
Yes, I do wonder why I'm here,
Yes.
being spoken. I mean, first of all, I'm thinking it's really interesting because if you'd asked me a few decades back, though I know probably you weren't around a few decades back, Mike, then I would have been much more influenced by my analytical background, which is so much about having to become invisible virtually.
Okay.
And so you don't give anything around about yourself. But I do know, and it's partly age, I guess. I know as time's gone on, I certainly know in terms of the work with dissociation that I found myself having to change quite a lot from, and I know that in the early days of working with dissociation and staying with the same patient or client over a period of time, they noticed that I became what they describe as more human. And I think it was about having to realize that there is the need for that authenticity and that genuineness as well, and that there's room for that as well as professionalism. And whereas psychoanalysis is very much that you are the analyst, the therapist, the specialist, and you are there delivering therapy to a patient. You know, what's clearly worked, and I've learned, is that it really is a partnership. You need the safety and the containment of a boundary, but you are two human beings that have areas where the person that is coming for help knows a lot more about a lot of things, but certain areas I happen to have something I can help with alongside them. And that only works if there is that too. Now, being psychoanalysis doesn't work. Going the other extreme and having no sense of separateness doesn't work either.
No.
So it's getting that middle ground. So I don't know why I've answered this question. I don't know what the question was actually.
That's
Mike.
great. I mean, because I suppose clearly the sort of the psychoanalytic pathway was your pathway, and then the dissociation has come in a bit later on, and you've learned to be different, or you've needed to be different. So what was it that brought dissociation into your world view, as it
Well,
were?
I mean, first of all, of course, my initial training wasn't in anything to psychotherapy. It was in business. Right. So I worked for a big company, traveled around in Africa, and then had my own small business. And it's only in my, late 30s that actually I was very bored with that and fed up with that, so that I changed. I mean, and so then psychoanalysis, was the way I thought, and I got a lot of encouragement to do the training there, because that was what was considered the only thing that might give you a chance to make a living out of it.
Okay.
And so I started with that, did the horrific thing that, looking back, if I'd known how long and how awful it was, it meant going to London for 3 days.
Right.
In order to
How many years did you have to do that for?
For 4 years from Norfolk. So I'd go in the 6 o'clock train and go down and have analysis, and then have some work during the day, and then another analysis the next day, and so on. And then come back and then have the rest of my life for the week.
That's a huge investment. Right.
Huge. And so I came out with 4 years and then settled in Norfolk and started working. And, you know, certainly in those days, the expectation was if you've been given a specific training, and it was mostly Freudian with some Kleinian and Jungian, you expect that the person who comes into the room, who are called patients if you're working privately as well, would somehow fit into your language. And in Freud's term, if they didn't, then they were either resistant or untreatable. And so that was the background. And so then, of course, then it turned up, as it happens to a lot of us, I think, that someone entered the psychotherapy room, the consulting room, and didn't fit into anything that I had been prepared for. Now,
that sounds very familiar.
And that must be familiar for a lot of people. And so you either go through, well, shall I pass this on? And a lot of people then start thinking that, and it can be overseen as specialized. It is complex, but it doesn't, but, you know, it requires everyone to still have the core training of whatever their training was. That is the one boundary you've got. It's then about how do you adapt that, really, that makes a difference into whether you're going to be helpful or not. I think what made me tune into it so easily was because my background is very mixed. I mean, I was born in the States of a French mother and Italian father, and so my first language was French. My father worked in The Hague, so I spent the first 8 years of my life in The Hague, going to school there, learning Dutch as well. And then at 8, my father was of the school that the best education you could have was to go to an English boarding school, prep school. So that, as I've explained somewhere else, that was my first experience of something dissociative happening, because I had to separate those two very worlds. You know, I was from a very emotion-charged family, French family, speaking French, with all that moving of the arms,
all the
and everything.
charm and the grace,
all the charm and the
warmth.
That's right. Into a very, in those days, a very formal, where people didn't even shake hands. You just, you know, I went there ready to shake his hand and to say hello, and the headmaster just did this. So immediately, you know, suddenly I was in a different. So in a way, that experience, so I didn't lose time or things like that, but certainly I kept those worlds very apart. And then the experience of having been part of lots of different cultures made it, I felt, familiar territory for me to suddenly hear some of the things going on. I didn't find it bizarre, alien. It sort of clicked. And I think that had a lot to do with finding myself drawn to it, I think, probably.
I would agree with that. I think I've heard this, and I feel bits of that myself, that there's something sort of almost built in to your own experience, is like in preparation for the dissociation to arrive. So when the person comes in who brings this, it's almost like it sets in motion all of those things that have just been waiting. So that's
a very good way of explaining it. It's there waiting,
like
isn't it? Like something released when the right time is there.
Because you can't be trained for that. That's your life experience, and that's what's brought you to that point. It's a kind of a serendipitous meeting. Then there's you in waiting, and there's this person comes in who needs what you're carrying, but maybe then you work it out as you go along.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It does feel like that. So with all of those moves, with your family, with all of these decisions that were going on, and your academic history, the clinical history, Freud, etc. Where are your influences then? You know, who were the people that you were sort of looking to and needing guidance from, or you just saw them afar, whatever it might be?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because I think the training in psychoanalysis, I found myself to begin with doing a bit what I did when I first went to prep school, which is watching, seeing what was expected, and being able to fit in very easily at one level. And then within that process, there was a moment when something had to change, because I wasn't coming up with the right theoretical paperwork I was supposed to do. And there was that moment where I wasn't sure I was going to continue, because really one of the things going in business is that I didn't see myself as particularly intellectual in a helpful way, to be able to articulate as well as be certainly in touch with my emotions, but less with my intellect. And so that then changed into managing to encompass that. And then I started finding it very easy. At the same time, I never quite felt comfortable with the whole power imbalance. When, you know, as a patient in training, you'd lie down and you had the analyst there, which you couldn't see. And there was a lot of silence. And so these are some of the areas. So when I had to change some of my approaches, a lot of those had to be changed.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's what you're describing then, is that very much what, almost like the stereotypical, you know, lie on the couch and the therapist is sort of sat behind your head scribbling into a notepad, and you're given nothing. You just have to release whatever. So that is what you went through. That is exactly what you were trained to be doing.
That's right. And you have no idea what's going on you've got no eye contacts. You've got no idea what's going through, what the analyst is doing. And so, you know, no wonder I remember these cartoons of where you see an analyst going and consulting with his stockbroker because he's heard some share being mentioned, while the analysand, as they're called, was there carry on talking out loud.
I can totally see how that would not work within a sort of dissociative.
Yeah, you can't really do that. No.
Absolutely not. So it's like, regardless, you had to move on. So were you? So who was there for you? So I consider you to have been one of my great influences. That, you know, without you kind of like meeting me and helping me in the early journey, I never would have arrived at this. So do you have an equivalent in your
well, I didn't till I started working in Norwich, because part of how I think a lot of people who are very self-sufficient, and certainly I was in terms of changing cultures like that, is not to need anyone. And so I not that I thought I had all the answers, but I learned to just make sure I didn't need to depend on anyone. And so, but one of the things that was required at the time of the analytical training is that if you hadn't got a medical background, you needed to spend 6 months in a psychiatric hospital and work with clinicians there. In order to, quite rightly, in order to get an experience of what it's like in organizations. And in fact, I have to say that if I'm thinking of one of the things that I think should be encouraged more, is that if someone is working in private practice and hasn't got experience of working in organizations like the NHS, they need to do that, because it makes a huge difference in terms of those two cultures being able to understand the challenges and limits of each of them, what they can provide. And I know in the early days, there was a lot of conflict between the private and the public sector, which actually has changed in a positive way. But that then meant that I met a consultant psychiatrist who became medical director, Dr. William Hughes, who I then worked with, and we did a lot of work together on dissociation this time for many, many years. And so I sat in on his outpatient consultation, and he was I mean, what I liked about him is that he both was very much the analyst, but he could also was human and could understand the pathology and understand the language of people who had difficult, serious childhood backgrounds, and be able to be human. And I think that was it was nice to see those two combined. So I would say he was a very important influence. And also to get that validation, because one of the difficulties if you're working in this field and you're not working with a medical background as a psychologist or psychiatrist is it's harder, and that would be one of the challenges, to be able to be taken seriously. I mean, I was lucky that there was virtually no one else involved in this area, so I got all the training, etc., from ISSTD or ISSD as they were at the time, and so that
it is there.
It helps that it's been there. That's right.
So that's really interesting, because what you were saying earlier about sort of finding yourself needing to be more human within the relationship with a dissociative patient, as it were, you sort of were given permission through William to be at that level. You saw it. There's a esteemed
That's the
consultant
point. If
psychiatrist
that could happen
offering you.
within a medical, exactly. If you could see that within
Yeah,
this formal, in a sense, formal structure, or
yeah,
in my mind, here was then that must be allowed. Whereas in the training, of course, none of that would be
yeah,
allowed. And of course, the it is changing a bit, but the psychoanalytic world finds it very difficult to, for a long time to begin with, even the notion of there being anything other than childhood fantasies, that
yeah.
actually trauma can actually happen. And we know that's been a problem in this country generally, let alone dissociation. That took a long time for
Yeah.
professionals to.
Created so much damage along the way, but
So much damage.
yeah, I mean,
So
I
much
think
damage.
I think we fully appreciate we're in a time zone where we can have, like, childhood trauma being a known and definite thing to be able to work with.
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, I love that. I love the way that a person influences as much as you. It's not just sort of reading a book and going, wow, that really meant something. It's you were shown something in those interactions, and that you've really taken it from. So your life has moved around a lot, hasn't it? I mean, different countries, different cultures, business, health, all of these sort of things that you've changed around and worked with. Do you ever look back and maybe wish you'd taken a different path somewhere along the line? Is there anything
It's funny because I was thinking of that, because I know that's one of the things that you said you might ask me. And it's very hard to do that, because, these paths, you don't know what it would be like if you'd taken another path. It's those moments where you could have gone left instead of right.
Yeah.
And so, and the same thing, I can look back and think, if I hadn't gone to boarding school, I wouldn't have learned about, have settled here, have been dissatisfied with my work in business, and found myself doing that. So in a sense, at times I've wished I'd had, I don't know, a medical degree, but then I know I wouldn't have probably been able to fulfill it at that time. But B, I also know that, like all professions, like all things, there are some downsides about anything you do. Yeah, so I don't think I really have got particularly, not that I can think of. No.
I think that's great. I think, it's nice that you think the challenge is just accepting the path that is offered to you and moving forward on it, making the best of things, which is, I guess, kind of what we advocate in a lot of our work, which is, the path you've been on may not have been your choice, but it's the path you're on. So what can we do with it?
That's absolutely.
We're sort of, and things get in the way, and things sort of cause us difficulties and problems. So I'm going to put you kind of like a sort of a negative and a positive type thing. So if there's been a negative, there's been an obstacle in your life, how, what's that meant to you? And then maybe what is something that you feel truly proud of overcoming an obstacle?
Okay. Well, the main obstacle was actually my partly dyslexia, which I had, but my feeling that I wish I had been much more able to have an academic side to me earlier on in life.
Okay.
Because, I mean, in a way, this is classic a bit, but in a way, I found myself in opposition with my dad, who was from a generation where there were definite truths. Historically, there were definitely truths of right and wrong. There were no nuances. The whole word of ambivalence didn't really exist for him. So I tended to be in conflict with that. And I think that probably promoted me to be much more likely to look things on too much of an emotional level and not enough. And of course, we all do that to some extent. So one of the really things that made a huge difference was being able to do this analytical course, psychoanalysis. And funnily enough, that moment, my dad was delighted, because part of he was a French professor in Columbia originally. And part of his delight was, here was I, interested in literature and interested in a whole field of science. His view, he saw it as a scientific subject. Okay, so he could relate to that. So he sent me all his old Freud books that I had no idea he had. And that, in a way, opened up something. So I'm really pleased. That happened.
That sounds wonderful. Did that, feel free to not answer it. Did that bring you together in a slightly different way? And that
absolutely,
really kind of
absolutely.
worked.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. There was a language in common, and of course, what happens with that, and it happens, you know, in our work, when you start beginning feeling that you have a potential for something,
right.
rather than either dismiss it yourself, which you can easily do, and often if you've got a trauma experience early on, it's so easy, and some of the clients we see, so easy to look at the blame as a fault of yours, and it's an incapacity of something lacking. To start finding that something is, because I found that in my training in London, eventually having got to that obstacle, that it was actually valued, and people start encouraging you, it sets something moving, and you start taking it up. So that's been a really very helpful development.
I can see, and interesting that you bring the word potential in, because that's something that we talk to our clients, patients about. The history's been not about meeting potential; it's about surviving. It's that sort of surviving, not thriving thing. And we talk about potential, and it's small seeds, isn't it? There's a momentum for potential. You sort of overcome an obstacle, a challenge, you beat that. You come to with all the support and resources and everything, and then you realize you can, and then that has
that gets you flying, doesn't it? I mean, I often say it's a bit like that. I'm always amazed how there are many people that I've worked with who will say somewhere along the line, there was something I could hold back that they couldn't get hold of.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So that there's a sense of something about someone is sort of preserved despite the enormity of some of the horrific things that have happened. And I've often equated that to, it's like an archaeologist that discovers a seed, going where you put the right environment in, and it can grow. And you see that those are those moments when it feels like you've been alongside someone along the journey of discovery. And you find that given the right, as best you can, including the mistakes you make inevitably, actually bring something to fruition. The difficulty is it can feel such a responsibility to hope it works, and we do our best. And but it really is. It always amazes me how the potential for something to change
is wonderful
and to grow.
And that pressure that you mentioned, that sort of the responsibility, the sometimes it feels like that, right? That it's us, we've got to try and figure this out. That's fine, that's our job, we accept that. So how do you manage that? How do you maybe either move away from the responsibility or have things in life that free you from that, so that you've got your own downtime? What does that look like for you?
Well, I mean, there's two things about that. One is within the therapy, it has certainly helped me to be able to, if I feel a responsibility about what's going on, to find a language to also hand it back in such a way that it's not dumping it, but it's trying to making it a sharing of it. That then means that neither one side is responsible. It's about trying between two people to try and make something happen, or to try and help something happen. Because I think there's something that can be suffocating about, and it's one of the difficulties, I guess, if someone takes in too much, because unless you're a good dissociator, it's very hard to take in some of the things you're wanting to be able to have it alongside you or in the room. And the importance is that you've been able to stay there and not be, in a sense, contaminated by it, because you can't, unless you dissociate, you can't deal with it. So that's one thing. In other words, to keep finding a way of sharing that in a way that's not judgmental either. The other thing is doing something completely different. I mean, I've always swum, and I've always gone swimming and walking and things like that. Something that doesn't use the brain that way, or gardening or whatever. That where you can't try and reason.
Physical work stuff, just going
physical work
does something.
And also being able to, have the need to be able to offload somewhere as well. Not to hold it in. It doesn't. That's why good supervision or a good peer group or something, where, and the same with multidisciplinary teams. Where you get to know it's not about getting the answer right. It's about being able to be confident enough to say whatever's on your mind, because you know it's there, and if you can find a way of bringing it out, it's not going to eat away at you, the same way.
And that's a trust equation in a huge way, because we need to be able to live our reality in the world that we're working in, and that's got to be safe. So in the same way, we're saying to the people we're working with, tell us your truth, tell us what you're holding. We need to be able to move ours along. So I see it as being like a chain. We get given something, we hold an element of that, we give some back, we move some along, that gets held. And the power or the negative power of it becomes diminished, and then the positive power of it is allowed to grow and flourish.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so good. And thank you for the supervision you've given me over the years as well. Because that has massively helped. So, but that's the thing, isn't it? That's what's needed. So you've clearly over the work that you've been doing, you've sort of been able to hold the work, been able to maintain yourself in all of these sort of things. So is there more for you to do? What does the future hold for you within this field, or within your...
Well, for the moment, now I've slowly cut back.
Okay.
I don't see people on a face-to-face basis on a regular basis, for therapy.
Sure.
So my focus has been more on training, supervision, assessments, and consultations with trusts and things when wanted. I think the difficulty is I'm too impassioned by it, so it's very hard to completely let go. So, and I have to learn. One of the things that I've always been convinced I will do, but you say these things, you're not going to do like your previous generation. It doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah.
Is that my individual therapy with the analyst I had in London? She was in her 80s, and she then clearly started, I think she started having very serious mental health issues.
Oh, okay.
And the difficulty was that when you're in a relationship like that, it's very hard to question it. And she eventually, there had to be 2 or 3 people in analysis with her that we heard about it from each other, that gave us the courage to then say, we've got to do something about it. So we went and saw one of the tutors there. But so I have to make sure that I don't keep going till actually begins to realize, there's always the tendency with people with sports just to go slightly too long.
That extra bit,
one
more game, one more tournament. Yeah.
I guess that's a mortality issue or immortality issue, I suspect, isn't it?
Yeah.
But other than that, I guess I'm really, one of the things I'm pleased about is that the knowledge of dissociation has just, it's so much more present now within NHS circles, not everywhere, but it's in the language much more.
It is.
And I know in the early days, one of the first things I did when I was in Norwich, and that was thanks to Bill Hughes again, was to run a supervision group, and began to see people, obviously, people talking about a patient, and clearly it was a dissociative thing going on. I didn't dare use the word dissociation because it would have been laughed out, and so I had to very slowly bring that in. But that's all changed. People, and people, you can talk about it now, and people know the language, and when you hear it repeated, then it's gone in, come out again.
And repeated in all sorts of different,
in all sorts of places,
venues and places and contexts and things. And I truly think that you have been very influential in enabling that. With the work that you've done at the Pottergate Centre, with the consultations, with the sort of the knowledge and the accessibility of it, the willingness to share and to talk about these things. It has made a difference, because it's not come easily, and bringing sort of dissociation into the limelight, for better or worse, in different areas and things like that, has not been an easy task.
It's not. Thank you. That's kind of you to say that. But I think one of the things that has helped me is to have worked in an organization to begin with when I was working in business. So that, because I think the thing that can happen is that there can be, and I think organizations do, and not only do organizations dissociate, we know that, but it can be it can be like a them and us. Whether you're either an organizing person and then you look on people who are working privately, or the other way around. And I think, in a way, I think what needs to carry on happening is to really view that interaction as, between the patient and the NHS or secondary services, and if there's a therapist, is to see that these are different aspects of the same issue. Yes. And to look at ways where respecting the differences, but somehow finding a way of working. It's a bit the same with having to work with very difficult, often very protective, difficult parts that are there, which you may, I made clear, I may not agree with you, but you're doing it for a reason. You're trying to keep this safe, and I need to understand. So finding a way to actually think, well, let's try and understand it from the other point of view.
From that perspective.
Yeah, and for clients to understand that from the perspective of their therapist and the NHS and organisation, rather than them and us, so then it becomes a confrontation, and then nothing changes.
And that's exactly it, isn't it? Because we're back into that survival mode. Everyone just hunkers down and they cocoon themselves away, and there's no growth outwards. There's no willingness to extend. And I think that's a massively important lesson. I really do. I value the time. I mean, in the clinical psych training that I did, we had various different placements, and being on inpatient settings was almost a certainty that you spend the time on there. 6 months I worked in a forensic hospital for 6 months.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Got that experience, and not just the theoretical, the academic-y clinical bits, but what always I learned, I think, most from anything else, was the importance of keys. Who had the permission to walk through doors, and the keys held the power. And because I was a trainee, I didn't have any keys, so I was constantly having to wait, looking through windows and kind of hoping someone would see you so that they'd open doors. And it gave you an insight that I was just there for that day, for that hour, for that appointment. I wasn't living there. That wasn't So I think having that sense of the organization, the size and the power of organization is because I suppose that's our version of the abusive parent in some respect.
No, that's right.
The misuse of power. So
it is down to misuse. That's right. And I feel for, I don't know what you're feeling, but I do feel for clinicians working within the NHS, but very much on their own. Because that's asking a lot, because you're risk then losing your safety, and you have to be careful that you don't do something against what's allowed or the protocol, and yet you are wanting to do the best you can. Absolutely. And so when there isn't enough support around, or you don't feel you can have a peer group support, that makes life so difficult if you're working with such complex areas and you're trying to do your best.
And that's why it's so important that there is the sort of the relationship between the private sector and sort of the public sector, as it were, for things like supervision and assistance.
That's right.
I suppose we the specialist nature of this field is that we reach out and we offer supervision, and because we know the importance of this, and I think that's part of the growth of the field, is that is certainly happening much more, and individuals are reaching out, getting help, we're providing the help, and
that's excellent.
It can make a huge
difference. Excellent.
So I think that feels like a really lovely place to finish, Rémy. So thank you ever so much for spending the time and giving us a bit of insight into your journey into dissociation, and some of the things and the hints and tips that you've picked up along the way for how to manage it, move with it, and improve what you work with. So I think from everybody watching the video, Rémy, thank you ever so much. It's been a great experience.
Well, it's been a pleasure doing that with you as well, Mike.
Thank you, Rémy. So
you're welcome.
So we'll finish the video there. As always, we're really interested in looking at the comments that people make, and the sort of the reflections and the views that people have on the conversation that we've had. I think it's always interesting looking at it from the perspective of someone with lived experience of dissociation and the people that are offering the help, because within the field we know the importance of sort of having both positions and joining them up and doing it respectfully and honestly. And I think this interview with you, Rémy, this conversation with you is has allowed some of the honesty to really sort of shine through. So thank you, Rémy. Thank you ever so much for everybody for watching. Please do all the usual stuff, the liking, subscribing and things for the channel. Keep a lookout for the videos through the notifications, and we'll keep producing content for you to enjoy. So between now and the next video, as always, please do take great care.